What's going on, guys? The Manadorks here. We are a new channel to the Magic scene, and today we have an Infectious Commander face-off between Skithiryx, Ziatora, Magus, and Strefan. Skithiryx, the Blight Dragon. The deck's plan is to come out swinging with a hasty, Infectious Dragon, hoping to power himself up enough with several different equipment and enchantments to one-shot players with Infect. Ziatora the Incinerator. Ziatora likes to play powerful creatures, then fling those creatures during the end step to deal massive amounts of damage to his opponents, and be rewarded with treasures. Magus, Lucia Kane. This is a precon commander with only 10 upgrades in the deck. Magus focuses on casting big X creature spells, and with her ability, copying those spells, making a crazy strong army of creatures. Strefan, Maru Progenitor. Strefan is a vampire tribalist that focuses on making multiple opponents lose life and get rewarded with blood tokens. Strefan uses those blood tokens to cheat in big attacking vampires and overwhelm the board with a blood-sucking army, draining the precious blood from their enemies. So without further ado, let's get into this toxic game. I promise you won't be disappointed. Alright, so here we go. Juan draws a card, plays a forest as land for turn, immediately tapping it to cast a Hardened Scales, and passes the turn. Ryan draws, plays a swamp, taps the swamp to cast a Soul Ring, and then if that wasn't enough, taps the Soul Ring, floating one colorless mana, casts Sensei's Divining Top. He then pays that one remaining colorless to his Sensei, tapping the top, looking at the top 3 cards of his library, and putting them back in any order. Bryce draws a card, and if player 1 wasn't enough, Bryce also plays a turn 1 Soul Ring, but then taps the Soul Ring for 2 mana to cast a Mind Stone. 2 draws for turn, plays a Kerpalsian Forest as land, tapping it for a Skullclink, and since everyone had a turn 1 play, passes the turn. 1 untaps, draws, and plays an island as land for turn. With no other plays, he decides to pass. Ryan untaps, draws, plays a mountain as land for turn, and then taps out to cast his commander, Strefan, Maru Progenitor. He then passes the turn off to Bryce. Who else loves a turn 2 4-mana commander? Bryce untaps, plays a swamp as land for turn, taps his land and the Mind Stone to cast a Whispering Scepter, and then passes the turn, and the rest of the table gets ready for the infectious shenanigans that are likely to begin. Player 2 plays a mountain as land for turn, then taps both to cast a Dockside Extortionist. With all those artifacts and enchantments on the battlefield, Dockside will enter, creating 5 treasure tokens. Gotta love that Dockside. He then dips into that treasure trove, sacrificing 2 to cast a Bloom Tender, which will give him even more juicy mana. But with nothing else to do this turn, he passes. Juan untaps, draws, plays a mountain as land for turn, and then taps out to cast a Pure Strain Genestealer. When Genestealer enters the battlefield, it triggers and puts 2 +1/+1 counters on itself. However, because of the Hardened Scales replacement effect, another +1/+1 counter is added instead. Juan then passes turn with nothing else. Ryan plays a Command Tower as his land for turn, taps the Command Tower for black, another swamp, and his Soul Ring to cast a Diabolic Tutor, allowing him to search his library for a card and add it to his hand. He then taps a mountain, paying more to his Sensei, activating the top and looking at the 3 cards on top of his library. He's allowed to arrange them in any order he pleases. Ryan then moves to combat, and he swings Strefan towards Juan, who can declare no blocks, and takes 3 commander damage. During Ryan's end step, Strefan triggers, since one opponent lost life this turn, and creates him a blood token. Ryan passes the turn off to Bryce, who untaps, plays a swamp, and quickly taps 5 to cast his commander, Skithiryx, the Blight Dragon. Having 1 black mana still available, he pays it, activating Skittles' ability, giving it haste. He then moves to combat, and sends it towards 2, dealing 4 commander damage, and considering Skittles has Infect, gives 2/4 poison counters. And with 2 poisoned, Bryce passes turn. 2 plays a forest as land for turn, He then taps the Bloom Tender, netting 1 green and 1 red mana, taps his remaining lands and 1 treasure token to cast his commander, Ziatora the Incinerator. He then sacrifices 1 treasure and uses that mana to equip the Skull Clamp to his dockside, increasing its power by 1. 2 then moves to his end step, where Ziatora triggers, and he chooses to sacrifice the dockside, dealing 2 damage towards Strefan, and creating 3 more treasure tokens. This 2 damage is enough to kill Strefan. The Skull Clamp also triggers on Dockside's death, and 2 draws 2 cards. Juan untaps, draws, and plays a Cinderglade as his land for turn, which enters untapped thanks to the basic lands he controls. He quickly taps out to cast his commander, Magus, Lucia Kane, hoping to copy some X spells in the near future. He then moves to combat, which triggers Magus, and he decides to put the +1/+1 counter on herself. This is supposed to be 2 thanks to the hardened scales, but the mistake is caught later this turn. He then moves to attackers and attacks Bryce with the Gene Stealer. On attack, Gene Stealer triggers. Juan decides to remove a 1/1 counter from it, bringing its power and toughness down to 3, to search his library for a basic land, in which he puts onto the battlefield tapped. Bryce declares no blocks and takes 3 points of damage. Juan then passes the turn. Ryan taps his mountain after drawing his card for turn, sacrificing a blood token, discarding a card, and draws another card, hoping to draw into something useful. With no luck, he pays 1 mana back to the Sensei, activating the top, looking at the top 3 cards of his library, and putting them back in any order. With Ryan feeling short on luck, and no other plays, he passes the turn. Bryce untaps, draws, and taps the Soul Ring and 2 swamps to cast a Corpse Cur, whose ETB does not resolve because there was no creatures currently in the graveyard. But he decides to move straight to combat and declares Skittles as an attacker, going towards Juan. Considering Juan has no flying blockers, he has no choice but to become infected, getting 4 poison counters and taking 4 commander damage. During Bryce's end step, Ryan decides to pay 1 mana to his Sensei again, activating the top. No longer the only infected player, 2 decides to shock in a Blood Crypt, paying 2 life as it enters. 2 then taps a Bloom Tender for 3 mana, 1 red, 1 black, 1 green, since he controls his commander, and uses that mana to cast his Professional Facebreaker. However, with the Facebreaker on the stack, Bryce decides to cast Diabolic Edict, targeting 2 to sacrifice a creature. Edict resolves, and the Bloom Tender hits the grave. The Facebreaker resolves and enters the battlefield. 2 then moves to combat, feeling a little broken, and decides to attack Bryce with his commander, Ziatora. Bryce declares no blocks and takes 6 commander damage. Since Ziatora dealt combat damage, the Facebreaker triggers and creates 2 a treasure token. Into second main phase, he taps out and sacks treasures for a total of 6 to cast Ancient Copper Dragon. Ancient Copper Dragon resolves. 2 then sacks 1 treasure and decides to equip the Skull Clamp to the dragon, increasing its power from 6 to 7. And with nothing else, he passes turn. Juan untaps, then plays a command tower as land for turn. He taps his commander, Magus Lucia Kane, floating 2 colorless mana, and then taps the rest of his mana for a total of 6 to cast Hydroid Krasis, where X is equal to 6. Magus then triggers copying Krasis, putting both spells on the stack. Juan resolves Krasis' cast trigger, gaining 3 life and drawing 3 cards. Both Krasis and the copy enter the battlefield with 6 1/1 counters on them, but thanks to hardened scales, they both get an extra counter, making them a beefy 7/7 with flying and trample. Juan moves to combat, triggering Magus, deciding to put a counter on the Gene Stealer, and thanks to the scales, it gets 1 extra. Juan then declares Gene Stealer as an attacker towards 2, but not wanting to block. 2 takes 5 life. Juan then passes the turn. Ryan untaps, draws, and then plays a mountain as land for turn. He then taps out and casts his commander, Strefan, Mara Progenitor, but thanks to the amount of mana needed to recast Strefan from the command zone, Ryan has no other choice but to pass turn. Bryce untaps, draws, and then taps 4 to cast a Cryptghast, who can double the mana he produces by tapping his swamps. he quickly moves to combat. Knowing Ryan won't block, he decides to infect yet another player, sending Skittles towards Ryan. Of course, Ryan declares no blocks and becomes infected, getting 4 poison counters and taking 4 commander damage from Bryce. 2 untaps and draws. He plays a City of Brass as land for turn. With no phase 1 plays, he moves straight to combat, declaring the Copper Dragon at Ryan for 7. Ryan declares no blocks, and the dragon connects. The Ancient Copper Dragon triggers and 2 rolls a d20, which lands a 9, creating 2 9 treasure tokens, going to a total of 11. The Facebreaker also triggers, seeing the dragon break face into Ryan, creating 2 another treasure. 2 sacks 2 treasures, activating the Facebreaker's second ability, which allows him to exile the top 2 cards of his library, allowing him to play them this turn. 2 decides to cast a Morbid Opportunist from among the cards exiled with the Facebreaker's effect, allowing him to draw a card when another creature dies. 2 then moves to end step, which triggers Ziatora. He decides to sack the Facebreaker, punching that Cryptghast in the face, killing it, and creating 3 more treasure tokens. The death of the Facebreaker triggers the Opportunist, and 2 draws a card. 1 decides to untap and play it Mountain as land for turn. He then taps 2 Forest and 2 Mountain and casts Triumph of the Hordes, which resolves, giving all his creatures +1/+1, Infect, and Trample until the end of the turn. Ryan saying, "Don't take me out." Juan decides to move to combat, which triggers Magus, and he puts a 1/1 counter on the non-token copy of Krasis, and thanks to Scales, it gets another. Juan decides to send the Genestealer towards Ryan and both Hydroids towards Bryce. Thanks to the incredible power of the Hydroids having both Trample and Infect, the Skittle player has no choice but to die to the infectious might of Krasis. Ryan declares no blocks, leaving him with 5 points of Infect damage. We realize during the editing of this video, due to Hordes powering up the Genestealer, Ryan should have gotten that final poison counter, taking him out of the game, but we unfortunately did not catch that while playing. During Juan's second main phase, he cast Explore, drawing him a card and allowing him to play another land this turn, in which he does, placing a forest onto the battlefield. Juan then passed his turn, feeling very accomplished. He was able to take out the Infect player, beating him at his own game. Ryan starts his turn by tapping a swamp, and then casting Dark Ritual, giving him 3 black mana. He quickly uses this 3 black mana to cast Beseech the Queen, allowing him to search his library for a card with converted mana cost equal to or less than the amount of lands he controls. With Queen on the stack, however, he decides to pay 1 to his Sensei and activate the top. He then resolves Queen, searching for an Aetherflux Reservoir, and adds it to his hand. Ryan then casts a Demonic Tutor, searching his library for a card, and putting it into his hand. Ryan then floats 1 mana off the Soul Ring. Considering he shuffled his deck, he wants to pay tribute to his Sensei again, looking at the top 3 cards of his library, activating the top. But with nothing else, Ryan passes the turn. 2 untaps, draws, and then immediately taps the Crypt for black and another to cast Pharises, enchanting Ziatora, which now completes this Infectious Incinerator. 2 then moves to combat, swinging Ziatora towards Juan and the Ancient Copper Dragon towards Ryan. With no flying blockers able to block Ziatora, and thanks to the poison counters Juan received from Skittles earlier in the game, Juan dies to Infect. Ryan declares no blocks and takes 7 life. Ancient Copper Dragon triggers on damage, Juan rolls a d20, and the result creates him 11 treasures. 2 moves to end step, which triggers Ziatora. He decides to sack the Ancient Copper Dragon and points 7 damage towards Ryan. But thanks to Pharises and Ziatora being the one that dealt the damage, Ziatora incinerates Ryan, giving him 7 more poison counters, making Ziatora the winner of today's game. How much Infect can there be in one Commander game? Ziatora came out ahead with a crazy and unexpected Infectious finish thanks to Pheresis, giving Ziatora Infect, flinging a creature, and incinerating the game. We hope you enjoyed today's game. We would love it if you could show some support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. We plan to post a lot more Commander games as well as other Magic the Gathering content for you all to enjoy. Thanks for watching. Until next time.